just in this past week, we've spoken about before, Pastor Brian Houston, founder of Hillsong Church, was under investigation. He was being charged because he apparently allegedly concealed the sexual abuse that his father did a long time ago. There's a whole bunch to the story. Links down below if you want to see some of the information. But after a number of years, I think it's 2 or 3 years, he's been found not guilty of concealing the truth. Now, I don't necessarily want to talk about the situation itself because I don't know the whole story. We don't know the people. We don't know exactly what happened or anything like that. I mean, the courts have found him not guilty. So the courts say he's not to blame. But what I do want to talk about really is this interview. I found it very interesting with Andrew Bolt. I love Andrew Bolt's reporting, the Bolt Report. He does. I think he has a good approach, a balanced approach. I think you could say. But during this interview, I felt like, yes, okay. The courts have found him not guilty. My actual first question to you, Dr. Rod, is just because the courts find you not guilty, how much should that see us as not guilty? If you know what I'm saying.
Well, I'm not 100% sure what you're saying, but look, if you've got any confidence at all in the legal system, you have to believe that the legal system gets to the truth. Now, I know that in many countries, the United States in particular, people are losing confidence in their system of justice because it's been taken over by the left, and I guess to some extent that's what's happened in Australia as well. Look, I think it's an interview worth watching. Obviously, you and I have watched it, and I agree with you. Andrew Bolt, he is one of the best commentators and interviewers on TV in Australia. He is conservative, but he's absolutely honest and open about that, which you don't get from those on the left. So I'm not interested now in making a judgment about whether or not he's guilty. I and my church prayed all along that justice would be done. And I believe that justice has been done. In other words, I believe that he is innocent of the charge because the court found him so. And if anybody wants to, they can go and get their hands on court documentation. So most of this is now public. And there were many others who also knew about Frank Houston's abuse. And the person who was abused as a child made the decision many years ago not to report it to the police and actually asked Brian Houston not to report it to the police. Brian Houston, however, saw to it that his father was disciplined both within his father's church and his own church and within the broader Assemblies of God in Australia. And he was stood down. He lost his credentials as a pastor. He did all that he could do at the time, bearing in mind the person who, by the way, at this time was about 37 years of age. That person still at that time did not want to report it to the police. So that the charge was that Brian Houston had not reported the incidents of child abuse to the police. Now, he had taken reasonable action and he'd followed the explicit wishes of the person who had been abused. So I'm quite happy to state publicly that I believe that Brian Houston was found not guilty because he was not guilty. As simple as that.
Now
I do.
Sorry, keep going.
Well, one has to wonder why the many other people who were in possession of the same knowledge as Brian Houston, some of them had that knowledge before Brian Houston had and did nothing about it. One must wonder why it is that Brian Houston was the only person who was charged. He was the only person pursued. I think that's a question worth asking.
So, yeah, of course. I suppose the point that, like, I agree with what you're saying. What I'm trying to get at, and I don't know how to clearly articulate it, but maybe this might be the right way. Just because he's been found not guilty of that charge doesn't make him blameless. I think that's what I'm saying. Like, it's not.
Well, I think it does. I look, before God, he's blameless. Absolutely.
No, sorry. So what I mean is it doesn't mean everything he's done is right. That I suppose that's what I'm getting at is a lot of people will now go, oh well, that's wrong because he's been found not guilty, but he's done all these things. Like, yes, he's made a lot of mistakes as a leader, right?
Yeah, but hang on a minute. If we're talking about that particular court case, no problem. Yes, he's made other mistakes, and he's been quite open about that. And I mean, obviously, and he's also paid a significant price because he's no longer global pastor of Hillsong Church.
But what I'm saying is this not guilty verdict isn't a blanket not guilty. It's a not guilty to that individual charge, right? And yes, he is not at fault for hiding the things. And I think that there's people on both sides of the fence of this story that people will go, see, he's found not guilty. That means he's done everything right. No, he hasn't. That's why, like, he even admits he made mistakes, and I just want to get to that.
Yes, I know, but in that interview, the mistakes he admits to openly with a little bit of prompting, and this is one of the things that makes Andrew Bolt such a good journalist. I think Brian didn't want to address some of those issues, but Andrew Bolt actually got him to do it towards the end of the interview. That's got nothing to do with child abuse. Totally different things.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is there'll be a lot of people on both sides. One side will be like, he's not guilty. That means he's innocent of everything. Well, no, it's about this one thing.
Look, people are not that stupid. People are not going to believe that, Craig. There might be a few fringe lunatics who do, but by and large, people aren't going to say, well, the guy's not guilty of anything in his whole life. And he himself, he's called one of those incidents his night of shame.
Yeah.
When he was influenced by he was at that time virtually dependent upon sleeping pills, which obviously influenced his capacity to make rational decisions.
Yeah, and I want to address that in a minute. Because there's something else I want to say about that. But what I'm trying to say is there's two sides, right? Let me get this out. There's two sides. There's one side that might go, well, not guilty means blanket not guilty. But then there's the other side that may say, well, no, he's guilty of everything, and lump him in with guilty of everything and ignore this and say that the system's rigged and everything like that because he has failed in other areas. I suppose what I'm trying to get at with this is the court has found him not guilty. And I think that's it's great that the court system has found him not guilty of this thing. I think we need to be very careful not to do blanket, oh well, that makes him, or then all of that stuff against him wasn't accurate. All those issues we've spoken about, a number of them, about the fact that he was properly and all that sort of stuff. We've spoken about that before, that there were a lot of leadership mistakes in there. Just because he's found not guilty doesn't mean that it admonishes him from all the leadership mistakes, nor does it also, because he's made leadership mistakes, then make him guilty of this thing that he's been found in.
No, but honestly, if you think either of those, if you're on either extreme, you're absolutely a lunatic. You're nuts. But all of us as Christians, all of us as leaders are imperfect.
Yes.
None of us is perfect. And he may be more or less perfect than either you or I am, but all of us are imperfect. One of the problems for somebody who has a high profile like Brian is that his imperfections sometimes become public. And then, of course, there are those in the media who want to pull down anything that's labelled Christian, and so they latch onto it, and they will often fill in a lot of blanks that aren't really there. And I think that's one of the things that has happened to Brian and also to Hillsong Church. Look, there's a season, there's an open season on Hillsong here in Australia every year, around about the same time, I guess, when news is a bit low, when Parliament isn't sitting and so on. There are always these great exposés. And look, the journalists, they can always find someone who's critical. Yeah. And I watched a long documentary on all the ills at Hillsong not so long ago. And I kept waiting for the person who was the primary interviewee. I kept waiting for that person to say the reason he parted ways with Hillsong was that he had an affair. He had a sexual relationship outside of marriage with someone else in that church. He never did. Now, to me, that person was utterly without cause.
Yeah.
And they never revealed. They never did the honest thing and reveal, well, actually, you know what? Just like Brian Houston, I failed in my role as leader.
Yeah.
So, look, I won't reveal who it is, but I know the facts because I've spoken face to face with the person involved. But look, I agree with you, all of us, but I don't think we should really be having this discussion in the context of the court case. But all of us fail as leaders, and that's why we're doing this podcast.
Yeah.
You and I wouldn't spend so much time and expose ourselves to a lot of criticism along the way if we thought we were perfect and every other leader was perfect.
No, that's kind of what I'm getting at is the fact that I think we need to be very careful when we are pointing blame at people to do blanket blame, right? Just because they do one thing wrong, now they do everything wrong. Vice versa. Like, look, here's the thing. Has Brian made some mistakes? Yeah. But have I made a lot of mistakes? I've probably made worse mistakes than him. Just he's had a bigger impact on the world, and so therefore his mistakes may have been amplified a lot more because of the people he was impacted. But I mean, we've all failed, and I think that what I'm trying to get at is when we're on this topic of blame, I think it's about what we're pointing our fingers at, and I'm more talking about us as an audience watching this story. Do you know what I mean? Like we need to be very careful of the people that have been super critical of Brian Houston and our content about him and stuff. It's like you can't just he made one mistake, made a mistake, but that doesn't make him guilty of everything that he's being accused of, and nor does him being innocent now mean he's innocent of all the things that he did. There is still responsibility that he has. And what I want to get to is, you mentioned him about, he said that he didn't want to talk about those other instances that Andrew Bolt did very good at trying kind of drew out of him. I must admit, now I know he doesn't want to talk about them. I don't know whether it was just he's not prepared, whether he's just exhausted, whether he's mentally he's not doing well and stuff like that. But I must admit, I was very disappointed in his responses. Very disappointed in his responses because I felt that he was not really taking responsibility. He was saying he was taking responsibility, but then straight away going, oh, but this and but that, but it was the pills, it was this, it was that, and not really taking the responsibility. How do we, I suppose as I started out this podcast, I said, there are sometimes like some things are out of our control. Some of them really, he took too many painkillers or medication and drank with it. Yeah, and the situation was the fact that the medication played up with messed with his mind or whatever. But I think blaming and pointing the finger at the medication, I don't feel like that. Is that justified?
Look, I think, one, you have to look very carefully at that whole interview, and two, you have to reflect on what he said about these matters before. And I don't think he has been reluctant to address these matters, even publicly, over a period of time. So I certainly don't have the same impression that you have. I would say this, however, one of the things that I spent quite a bit of time thinking about was the way he speaks. Mm-hmm. And if you've never heard Brian Houston speak before, if you've not watched any of his sermons, or if you haven't been in a small, sort of small audience setting where he's been speaking. Look, I don't know him personally, but I've heard him preach, I've heard him talk fairly often over the last 25 years or so. He's not a good public speaker. If you listen to him preach, he's not the world's best preacher either. His delivery is not all that good.
Well,
now, if someone
in his leadership book, Live, Love, Lead, I think he starts it off by talking about how he had a stutter and
look, honestly, he's not that confident in public speaking. So someone could listen to that interview with Andrew Bolt, say, "Oh, he's shifty," and I've listened to it and I've carefully analysed it, and he's just Brian Houston. He's not all that articulate. Mm-hmm. So he would have found that interview, I think, very, very difficult. He's not like you and I at all. I don't think you and I are much more confident in terms of our presentation. We're doing this live, and we're pretty confident in doing that. I don't think he's like that at all. So I don't think he was being shifty. I don't think he was trying to avoid responsibility. He clearly didn't want to talk about those issues in that interview because the interview was about a different subject. But I think the genius of Andrew Bolt is that he did draw it out of him, and I think Brian was quite open about admitting what the problem was. And yes, I suppose you could say he kind of did blame his dependency on sleeping tablets at one point and so on, and the interaction between some alcohol that he probably shouldn't have been drinking. And I can't remember what other medication it was. I think it was anxiety medication at the time. He did say, I did have a problem with substance abuse in reference to the sleeping pill. So I actually think he was refreshingly open about it, so I don't have the same perspective that you do. But there is one other point, I think, which is worth making. When we are high-profile leaders, when we do make just one mistake, it can do great damage to our organisation. And in this case, the revelation of those two incidents, the whole issue of his father's sexual abuse, which has actually followed him around for 25 years now, it has done damage to Hillsong Church. For that, I deeply, deeply grieve. I've prayed for the church. Look, I know Hillsong pastors. I've grieved for the pastoral team, for the staff, for all the people who go to Hillsong churches. They've had a really tough time. But Hillsong Church has actually done a lot of good for the community as well. And look, I'm Pentecostal. I agree with his philosophy in life. The best is yet to come. I believe that, and I believe that and pray that for him, for his wife, for Bobby, and for the church. And my understanding is that after a period of dreadful trials, the church is starting to get back on its feet again. And I just praise God for that, because Hillsong Church has so much to offer. It has given the Christian world so much. It's reached out into the communities around their congregations. It's done a lot of good. And look, I think here in Australia, a lot of the problem that Hillsong has, it's our Aussie tall poppy syndrome. We don't like to see people succeed. We find successful people, we find successful churches and other organisations, and we do everything we can to tear them down. So my response to anybody who wants to criticise Brian and Hillsong Church is, so you tell me what you've done to advance the kingdom of God. Then we can start talking.
Yes. I want to... let's shift our focus from Brian.
Probably a good idea.
And because I want to talk about it metaphorically, right? And what taking the lesson from it. What do we do as leaders? So, because I actually feel like the responses that I've heard from him, he does put too much blame on the medication. It was the medication's fault. It was my substance abuse, or that sort of thing. What do we do in a situation where there is something that has actually caused our issue or caused whatever? How do we take responsibility while being real and analytical about what led up to the contributing factors without looking like we are just trying to shift blame?
Look, I mean, this is all part of being an authentic leader. I think one of the mistakes many leaders make, particularly in the Pentecostal world, is that if we are sick, if we're suffering from anxiety or depression or something like that, we're not really willing to share that with others. And especially we're not really willing to share that with our elders or our board if we have a board. I've had the experience where a pastor I was associated with burnt out. I had no idea it was even on the horizon, but the culture was we never share with our leadership team. In this case, I was on the board. We never share with the board. We share with our upline, and that's somebody who's not actually associated with the local congregation. And I just felt that's terrible. Fancy having to operate like that, because your team, your leadership team, they should be around you to support you, in your weaknesses as well as in your strengths. Yeah. And without wanting to be critical of the so-called upline, they're not in the local church. They're removed. And I suppose on the one hand, the strength of that is that they might be able to look at the situation somewhat objectively, but they've got no idea what's going on in the congregation. They've got no idea how many hours the pastor is putting in. They've got no idea what the pastor is shouldering in terms of responsibility for prayer and faith in a difficult situation and so on. But I think you've got to level, at least with your board and with your elders, if you're in a sticky situation, or if you have fallen into some kind of moral failure, like maybe an affair, even if it's fleeting, a one-night stand or something like that. I think you need to fess up, and you need to do it quickly, and then you need to be responsive to what the board or the elders or the other leaders have by way of direction or correction. So, look, it is really difficult. It's not easy at all. Being a leader is tough. If you want to be a leader, you need to check to see whether you've got some courage to start with, because you're going to need a lot of courage along the way. And, looking at Brian's situation, when this stuff blew up a few years ago, a couple of years ago now, the first thing I did, being me, I went and had a look at the structure of the church. And my conclusion was that really the source of Brian's problems was that he chaired too many boards. I can't remember the number. It was either 5 or 7, which is too many. I don't think you can chair more than 1 or 2. If he'd come to me for advice, and there's no reason why he should, right? But if he had, I would have said, you've got to chair the board, which is at the pinnacle of the organisation. You have to have other people chair. You've got to trust other people to take delegation and to chair those other boards, and they need to be reporting to you on a regular basis. Yeah. So I just think that he had too much responsibility, which ended up weighing very heavily upon him. And that was, so it wasn't substance abuse fundamentally that was the issue in my view. And I think those of us in evangelical and Pentecostal churches have to watch this thing, because, we get a vision from God and we become its parent. And we're so reluctant to allow anybody else to take our baby, to take our child, that vision and work with it. I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of trust, but we must do it. We've really got to narrow our span of control. We have to learn to delegate. We have to trust others with various levels of delegation. And then we should be very careful about, if you like, quality control, but focus on quality assurance, which is a very different thing altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. Just remove the pressure. And I think that is an issue that leaders have, is it's kind of expected that a leader needs to carry pressure. And yet, that's why we're leaders, because we can carry a little bit more pressure than the average person. We do have that ability to push through a little bit more. But it's not our Superman cape. It's not like we are not superheroes. We shouldn't be shouldering all the pressure. We need to make sure we've got a good support network around us, a good team. I mean, I was sharing with one of my clients today, like, I've been going through for the last, number of years now, but more concentrated the last couple of months to the last 3 to 6 months. I've been going through some major personal challenges, and to a point where I would say I have been, managing a mental breakdown, so to speak. And I was speaking to my clients about it. They're like, yeah, because you got the tools. It's like, yeah, I've got the tools. I've got the support network around me that I'm not carrying this. I've got you as my pastor. I've got my psychologist. I've got my intercessors praying. We've got, I've got people around me that I'm not carrying all the pressure myself. And I think if I didn't have that support network, I would be a dribbling mess in the corner and would have, probably ended up in some sort of a padded room, because I've been in a tough place, but I've been able to manage it because I've got my support network, and it didn't break me. And so I think that we need to make sure that we have that support network around us and don't shoulder too much pressure. We're not the leaders because we've got to carry it all. No, we just happen to have received a message from God, that gave us a vision, but it's our responsibility to build team. That's a point of a leader, not that we got to do it all. It's, as a leader, you may have gotten a vision, but it's now to rally other people with a similar vision, with the same vision, that are aligned with our vision. Rally those people around us. Let's work together so that we're all carrying the load rather than the leader at the top carrying all the pressure. Hey, you just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership Podcast. If you like that, hit the like button and put a comment below. Hey, if you want to watch more videos like this, check out our channel, and while you're there, make sure you subscribe.